In part 1 of our interview with Ken Penders, we spoke of how he became involved with Archie Comics Sonic the Hedgehog, and how he there came to expand both the range of characters, as well as massively flesh out both the lore and the mythology. Now, in part 2, we will cover him leaving Archie Comics, and the much publicized lawsuit.
There were a couple times I wanted to leave the series much earlier, for other opportunities. But I stayed with it. One of the reasons still was my son, who was still such a big fan. And the other reason was okay, back when Knuckles was in his own, when the stories were in the backup of the Sonic book, from issue 88 through 124. Knuckles had been converted into this green version of himself because he had absorbed all this chaos energy, and we kept him green for a while there because I hadn't figured out yet, when do I get him back to normal, under what circumstances. And Justin called me up one day and he said, "Victor wants to know why Knuckles is green." I said, "Well, he's green because he has all this energy. You know that, Justin." And he goes, "Well, can you get him back to normal, for Victor's sake?" And I said, "Okay, fine." And it hit me when I finished up this one storyline that, okay, to get him back to his normal self, we're just going to have to kill off Knuckles and then take it from there. I had no clue where I was going to take it from there, but I did the storyline where Knuckles was killed off, and it allowed me, I should say, to do a storyline that recapped everything that had happened in the series up until that point, so I could start fresh moving forward. Because of all the new readers we kept on coming to the book. And then Justin wanted me to do things a certain way. Yes, he wanted me to essentially take Knuckles back to the way he was back in Sonic issue 13. And I said, "What? You mean you want to just eliminate everything that came before?" And he said, "Yeah, let's go back to issue 13. And I said, "Well, I guess you're going to have to find somebody else to do that, because I'm not about to eradicate everything that I did." And at that point, Justin was upset that I didn't want to do what he wanted. That was like the first real act of defiance on my part. So we sort of parted company. I was supposed to work on issue 125, and now I no longer was. And so you'll notice from Sonic issues 125 through 130, I was not on the book. And for a couple months there, I wasn't, until Justin called me back, and he asked me, "What would it take to get you to come back to do the Knuckles stories?" I said, "Let me do Knuckles in the future. Do the Knuckles 20 years later storyline that I had pitched for the Sonic Super Special, which was canceled shortly after, around issue 90 or thereabouts." And I said, "That's what I want to do." So he said, "Why don't you do it? You can use Sonic and call it Mobius 20 years later or whatever." And I said, "What's the catch?" He goes, "Do you have a problem if Carl uses the Knuckles characters, in the regular Sonic storyline?" Because up until that point, I still was the only writer who dealt with the Knuckles cast of characters. So I said to Justin, "No, if Carl wants to do whatever he wants with the characters, that's fine. The only thing he can't do, as far as I'm concerned, is kill off Locke or Julie Sue. But anything else, is fair game. He can do whatever." And as far as I was concerned, that was fine. I didn't care, because I looked at it like, here's the timeline where Carl is working on the characters, and I'm working on a storyline that's 20, 25 years in the future. Anything can happen in the years in between that you can write a story about and get yourself out of whatever mess happened in the past. So I said, so I never had a problem with whatever Carl did. All I requested was he just not kill off Locke or Julie Sue. That's it. And if he did want to do something, if he could just ask me on those two characters only. That's it. And but otherwise, do whatever he wanted.
Some of the more controversial stories that you introduced, including the one you just talked about, and the one with Knuckles dying, and some of the other ones you brought up earlier, and along with even some of the relationships between some of the characters have been controversial among a lot of the fans. How do you react to some of those things? And
there has always been controversy on the Sonic series on any number of levels. We had, for example, one German fan who kept trying to get us to fire artist Dave Manick because he didn't feel that Dave was a good enough artist. Likewise, when I threw in the storyline where Antoine was predestined to marry Sally, this was back in issue 60. This is what Sally's father, the king, wanted. The reaction we got from that, the mail just blew up. We were getting reader responses. I was hearing it in my email, on my website, where people could post on the message board. But the thing was, the readers actually got more involved because I would do these things like, saying, Sally's supposed to marry Antoine, according to her father. And, or when I introduced Jeffrey and had him as a rival for Sonic for Sally's affections. Yes, we did have controversy with the Mobius 25 years later storyline on a number of levels because, a lot of readers were wondering, okay, well, if this happens in the future, then that means, Carl can't do anything with the characters in the past. And I would continually have to say, no, anything can happen to the characters. Just, the character could even die. We don't know what the circumstances are. This is comics. If you don't see a body, there's always a chance for resurrection. So it all depends what the storyline is. It all depends what the events are. You just can't say this is not possible or that's not possible without all the details. So that was always a constant. The other thing was, the relationship of Sonic's parents. Sonic doesn't have parents. He's cool by himself, that kind of thing. He shouldn't be with Sally. He should be with Amy. There was always something. There was a controversy. You name it, it was there. So it was just something we dealt with. My perspective is different from the fans, and you have to understand that. For example, we saw reactions of fans to certain creators, certain writers, certain artists during the course of the book, and the fans would say, "Why aren't you doing this, to me instead of this person?" Or, we like how this person draws. Why don't you, get him to draw instead of that person? That kind of thing. So the controversies weren't just in the stories. There was always something that set off some element of fandom, one way or the other, because they liked saying things a certain way. I, for example, had a tendency to gravitate toward artists, Pat Spaziante or Art Malinay or Stephen Butler for my assignments. If I wasn't illustrating myself, those would be the guys I went to. But because they all had their own strengths, and like, for example, with Ed Game, I thought, Art had worked on storyboards for the Saturday AM series, and I thought that his rendering of the characters would bring a certain sympathy to how events played out, and his version of what I wanted was absolutely, on target, so that when we did the expanded version of Sonic 50 for Sonic Super Special 6, which we call the director's cut, that's when we restored it to the full version. When Sonic kisses Sally, I insisted that Art be the one to draw that page. There was nobody else that could handle that page the way he did. And this is not to say the other artists weren't capable of drawing that page, but Art's style specifically worked for that moment, and readers agreed. So I was happy with that call.
We have to address the legal situation with Archie Comics, because it is quite unprecedented. Now, from what I understand, and do correct me if what I understood is wrong, but basically from our research, what it looks like is that in 2009, you filed copyright claims to the characters you had created for Archie Comics, claims which were subsequently granted, meaning that those characters became your intellectual property. Archie attempted to file a cease and desist notice due to you having signed a work-for-hire contract, which they failed to produce in court. The legal process ended with a settlement in 2013. Now, that's quite remarkable, but is this understanding accurate, or is there more to it?
It's both accurate, and there is much more to it than that. Okay? It's like anything else, it's not a cut and dried yes or no answer here. I left the book in 2005 because I was more interested in working in the animation industry at that point. And also, at the time I left working on the book, my partner Larry Houston and I were very much involved trying to get a Sonic movie project off the ground with SEGA of America. This would be an effort that started back in early 2003 and would continue until the summer of 2007. And so I figured, okay, here, my involvement with Sonic is evolving into this movie project. And I get to work on all these other things. For example, I was doing storyboards for a series called Alien Racers, which I think ended up airing a few episodes in Canada, but I don't think it ever aired here in the U.S. I also did storyboards for a Bratz animation video, and I even got involved in storyboards for film projects. And sometime, late 2006, I was approached by the people at Shout Factory, that do all these video releases. They were doing the Saturday AM series as a collected box set. And they tried to get hold of artist Pat Spaziante initially for the project, but Patrick said he was just way too busy. And so then the people asked if I would do the cover art for the thing, since they knew I was an artist, and as well as the writer. And so I said yes. So I submitted some designs. They approved it. I went and did that design. And since that was coming out, I contacted Robert Leffler at SEGA, the licensing manager Larry and I had been working with to try to get the Sonic film project off the ground. And I asked him, can I do this promotional, do T-shirts and a limited edition print, that kind of thing, to sell with the video box set. And he said he granted us permission. He granted me permission, I should say, and went forward with that as a limited collectible, that kind of thing. And so I figured, all right, this is helping establish our business relationship together. And Robert was keeping in contact with us, and this was early in 2007, like January through March. We were trying to establish a date where Larry and I were going up to San Francisco to the SEGA offices to meet with SEGA executives, with Bob setting up the whole meeting. And he said, well, we're having to delay things because everybody's trying to figure out, we want to do this total revamp of Sonic, where we coordinate everything, video games, the comics, the toys, the film project. Because all during the time we were pitching the film project, we were making it clear that since we were doing a 3D animation of Sonic, that whatever digital assets we were creating, that SEGA would have full access to, that they could create a video game with this material. So we were always in a partnership mode as far as the project was concerned. And that's what Bob liked about the whole thing. So we were working towards this end goal, and then all of a sudden, there's no contact from Bob. We're wondering what's going on here. And for the next 3-4 months, we hear nothing. And it's not until like June or July of 2007 that I get contacted from SEGA. And the new licensing manager calls to tell me that Bob had contracted cancer and had just recently passed away. And we were just stunned because we had known Bob for 4 years. We had developed personal relationships with him. We felt like family at that point. So it really was a shock to all of us, when we heard that. As a matter of fact, SEGA, Dana Lopez, I believe her name is, was the licensing manager at that time. And she notified me that the last project that Bob was working on was a 15th anniversary commemorative Sonic statue. And they had a number of these made up. And she wanted me to receive one of these things. I still have that. And I was, I was proud that that they would think to send that thing to me, So then I was contacted by SEGA Vice President Rob Leitner, and he agreed to meet with Larry and I at a hotel he was staying at in Beverly Hills, and we would discuss, moving the Sonic movie project forward. This was after we had exchanged some email communications. So we met with Rob, and it looked like, things were going to move forward. And then again, SEGA had corporate issues and the whole thing collapsed. And at that point, we had nobody we could contact to move the thing. It just seemed like SEGA was in such a state of chaos. So I said, well, let's leave it be and we'll take it from there. And I didn't think about it at that time. I figured, well, maybe somebody's trying to tell me something Sonic is behind, and I could live with that, that's what it is. That's what it is. But then in September 2008, I get a phone call from some friends, and they tell me, hey, what's your material doing in the new Sonic game? Are you getting any credit? Are you getting any royalties? I go, what are you talking about? And that's when I heard about Sonic Chronicles for the first time. And they were explaining it to me. I go, really? And so I checked out the BioWare website. And there on the website, fans were having a discussion over how much, material was, due to my work. There was one person especially that laid it all out there on the BioWare website, how the writer of this thing, had done a good job with the game until he got to this certain part with Shade and the Nocturnal Clan. And he started drawing all the comparisons, like how this guy owes me credit for this part. And they're going, I'm starting to have a feeling of deja vu reading this stuff, because a couple years prior to this, at the San Diego Comic-Con, someone had approached my better half, Bernadette, and my son, Stephen. I was away from my table at the time, and they represented themselves as someone from BioWare, and they were interested about talking to me, concerning working on the video game they were planning. And so Bernadette and Steve told them I was away, and that if this person came back, I'd be available to talk with him. But nobody ever came back, and I just totally forgot about the matter until 2008, when people started calling me up about the video game. So I had never experienced anything like this before, where somebody was making use of my material in another format without my permission. And they're thinking to myself, what do I do about this? So I discuss it with my family, and Bernadette says, I think you need to speak to a lawyer about this. So I contacted a couple different attorneys, and it was clear I needed to do one of two things. One, I had to establish copyright, and two, I need to establish I hadn't signed any work for hire documents. And I was still trying to figure out how to move forward, because when I spoke with these two different lawyers, they both made it clear that unless I had absolute documentation, as far as either item goes, they didn't see any point in talking to any further to me. So I made a few calls to colleagues of mine, and my friend Larry. And Larry was the one, I think, who put me in touch with attorney Michael Lovitz. And so Bernadette and I made an appointment to see Michael in his downtown Los Angeles law office at the firm he was working at the time. So we met with him, and Mike listened to our story, my story, I should say, and Bernie corroborated what parts, she could, because she had been living with me since 1995. So I told Michael that here I was working, submitting stories for Archie. I had never signed any work for hire contract whatsoever with the company. All I had ever signed were these work vouchers. And the work vouchers basically stated my name, my address, the story I worked on, how many pages, and what exactly did I work on. Did I work on the writing? Did I work on the penciling, the inking, the color, what have you? And I would check off whatever items I had worked on. Okay, and that's how they would figure out the total amount. And I would sign the work orders, and I would send them in with my work to Archie, and the editor, whoever the editor was at the time, they would fill out the necessary codes, on the paperwork, because the codes would correspond to each story. And I think if you look at the issues, there may be some stories where you actually see the code somewhere, on one of the pages, and because I've noticed the code like on DC Comics, for example. That's how they track things. So I told Michael that was it. That I had never signed any work for hire documents. This is the only type of paperwork. And Michael's listening to this, and he's just absolutely astounded. He goes, "Did anybody get any of this paperwork?" I said, "No, nobody did. Absolutely no one." So Michael was the one who suggested to me that I get in contact with Archie and see it, because Michael said if they have any work for hire documents, okay, any normal company would be presenting these things immediately just to shut you down. If I went to Disney, if I went to DC, if I went to Image, no matter who it was, they would show me any work for hire documents immediately. Say, here, go away, you're bothering us. Here's the... Archie didn't do that. I contacted Victor Gorlick. I contacted him, I think, no less than 3 separate times. I said, Victor, are you sure there's no work for hire? But I was also operating under the guise of, you guys still haven't returned some of my original art, and here's some last, minute house cleaning I just want to take care of so I can close the book on this once and for all. Victor, I think, responded once, said he didn't have anything, and never responded to anything else after that. So I waited about 30 days, and I called up Michael and said, this is the result. And Michael said to me, okay, you did your due diligence. You asked them if they have any work for hire documents. Go start filing your copyrights. This was January 2009. And I knew it was going to take a while for them to process all this. So I submitted, initially, I submitted something like 90 different stories for copyrights. And so I sat and waited for about a year. And then I began contacting the copyright office. And then initially I was having difficulty getting through to anyone. And finally I got through to the guy who was in charge of the department. And he said that the reason they're having a problem is because they're not sure of what material I can claim and what material belongs to other individuals, because it's a collaborative effort. And so this individual at the Copyright Office, he assigned me his deputy. His name was William T. Briganti. And Mr. Briganti proceeded to work with me in defining the limits of what I could claim on the copyrights. For example, on this story, did I claim ownership of just the story, or the art, or the characters? What was I claiming ownership of? And with each individual story, I'd have to say, well, I wrote the text for this story, I did the layout for the cover, and I inked it as well. And in figuring out what I did at each story, I was also claiming, I do not claim any ownership, for example, of this person's penciling, or that person's inking, or the advertisements in the book, or the format of the comic. I'm just claiming just exactly the work I did. So I had to do that for every single issue, every single copyright I had filed for. And so we worked through it, and we made categories. Okay, here, category A, stories I just wrote in text. Category B, stories I wrote and illustrated. And category C, stories I wrote and provided layouts for. Because when I showed them the page layouts that I provided to the artist, it was the Copyright Office who established that I had a legal claim to co-ownership of the art, because the artist based his work from mine. So, we ended up working our way through every single story I had submitted for. And then came April 21st, 2010. And Mr. Briganti informed me that we had just gone through the initial 90, and he wanted to know if there was anything else. I said, yes, I still had a bunch of outstanding stories I wanted to file ownership for. And he said that he was going to serve notice to Archie and SEGA what I was doing, because he recognized that they may have a legal claim to the material, and he wanted to give them a chance to respond to my claims. Okay. Now, you have to understand, this is a critical moment. I understand it's a critical moment. He faxes me a copy of the letter that he has sent Archie and SEGA. And basically, he's letting Archie and Sega know what's going on at this moment, and if they contest it, I'm dead in the water. They are not going to recognize my legal claims to the material. They're already informing me that I will have to fight it out in court before they recognize my claims. Because the way our system works, Archie and Sega didn't necessarily have to have anything to back up their claims. All they had to say is, hey, he worked for us, work for hire. That's all they had to do. And I would have been stopped, dead in my tracks, right there. So the notices went out. They were sent certified mail to both Sega and Archie, and I got a copy as well. And then I was faced with a decision. Do I want to continue and register all the rest of my stories I hadn't copyrighted yet, or just wait until Sega and Archie respond? So like a gambler at Vegas, I rolled the dice and I said, okay, I'm going to finish filing registrations for all the remaining stories. And not only did I register for all my Sonic and Knuckles stories, but I also registered copyrights for an Archie story I wrote, a Betty story, a Jughead, and a Sabrina story, as well as the copyright for my own creation, The Lost Ones. So I submit all this material, and we're waiting. May 21st, 2010 comes along. I call up Mr. Briganti at the Copyright Office. He says, nope, haven't heard anything from them. He even confirms it via email, which I have. And he says, I will start recognizing your copyrights, with letters of certificates beginning June 1st. And I said, fine. In essence, he was essentially acknowledging the copyrights were mine, but at the same time, he was also giving Archie and Sega an additional 10 days. I think he was, covering himself just to be on the safe side, and I don't blame him one bit. So January 1st comes along, and sure enough, they begin sending the copyrights, the letters of certificates, to me. And I received, between that point and the mid-July, I received 170 certificates of U.S. copyright. Every one of my individual stories legally covered. So I called up Mike Lovitz, and we made an appointment to get together, in a few days. I told him what had happened. And he came over, and we discussed what we're going to do next. And basically, he was going to sit down, which he did, and he wrote Archie a letter saying, look, you guys have been infringing on my client's material, because by this point, Archie had begun reprinting my stories in the Sonic Archive editions. And so Michael was taking the approach that they owed me royalties for this material. And if they wanted to continue publishing the stuff, we had to come to some sort of agreement. And that was the thing about Michael. Michael liked to work things out. Michael was into negotiation. He was not into confrontation. So, so he proceeded to send the initial letter to Archie. And Archie responded by saying, go away, here's the work for hire agreement that we have. And he faxed us copies of, and Archie had faxed Michael and I copies. No, Michael, yes, that's right. Archie faxed Michael a PDF file with the supposed work for hire documents I allegedly signed. And Michael then emailed me the documents. And I took a look at them. They're going, I never saw these things ever in my entire life, not once. And so Michael proceeded to do some due diligence on how strong would these documents be hold up in court. And he talked to a number of other attorneys, and basically everyone looked at it as a crapshoot. You know, it could go either way. So Michael proceeded to take the tack that these documents were illegitimate. He informed Archie as such, and we, tried to, negotiate. And Archie's response, they were led by a man, let's see, Josh, I think it was from the Cullen Law Firm. And there was an individual who was in charge, and I believe Matt Wagner worked under that individual. And the letters were beginning to take a more confrontational approach, but they were still sounding like they were willing to work out an agreement. We couldn't decide which. And Michael was starting to get the feeling like they were going to do something, but he wasn't sure what. And just before Thanksgiving, 2010, Michael received notice that Archie had filed lawsuits in federal court in New York, that they were going to sue me for $250,000 and for tortuous business practices. I was interfering with their business, and basically they wanted me to go away and pay up, that sort of thing. And so Michael proceeded to figure out how we were going to fight back. And we happened to, Michael had a couple friends that were already lawyers in New York, and they were handling things. They were agreeable, I should say, to handling matters in New York as far as like court filings and that kind of thing. So we were trying, because Michael and I are based in Los Angeles, California. And here Archie was trying to sue us in the New York court. And we were already trying to figure out if we could get the case moved to California. Because here's where I was living and working. It became an issue of jurisdiction. And I discovered I was about to get a real education of the American law legal system in a number of ways. So Archie and my lawyers engaged in back and forth trying to work out a settlement prior to going to court. And they did something really slick. They were making it sound like the closer we got to going to court, that it wasn't necessary for me to show up, that all it was just the lawyers had to show up. And then like 2 days before going the court date, when we had to initially respond to the lawsuit, that's when Archie's lawyer said, he's got to be in court. He's got to show up. If we're going to have any settlement talks, he's got to be there. It really wasn't important for me to be there, but Archie decided that they were going to stick it to me every which way possible to make life uncomfortable, that would get me to drop out. So I had to purchase 2 airplane tickets, one for me, one for Michael. At the last minute, we took a red eye out to New York City, slept on the plane. We got into New York about 6 o'clock in the morning, took a cab from LaGuardia to the New York Federal District Court, and we met up with this other lawyer that had been helping us. And he was handling the initial filings with the court. And we met for breakfast, and then we went over to court. And we proceeded to go before Judge Berman, who would oversee the case the entire length of the time. And that's when Judge Berman set us up in a conference room off his courtroom to discuss settlements. And that was an interesting experience because that's when we discovered how far apart we were. You know, basically, when you get into negotiations, you always go, the sky is the limit, and then work your way down from there. Okay. So when Michael and I were traveling on the plane, to be perfectly honest, Michael was recognizing that if Archie was smart, they would just make me a cash settlement right then and there, and buy me out completely. And there was a number we discussed, and it was way less than what Michael was asking for during the negotiations. But he asked me if I would be comfortable with it. I mean, if that's what it came to. And basically, the number we discussed would recover all the costs I had incurred up until that point. Michael would get paid, and I would still come out with a chunk of money. Okay, and when I say chunk of money, we're not talking millions of dollars or anything like that. We're just talking, in business terms, what would be considered, chump change, really. But that was the reality I was facing, because Archie had this document, okay, and if they wanted to do a settlement, I would be avoiding the costs of having to prove that document was illegitimate. So Michael was looking at this from a strategic point of view. What was the least costly end game on this whole thing? So we got into the conference room, we started getting negotiations, and it was really clear that Archie's side was not interested in negotiating whatsoever. The amount they offered was ridiculous. I mean, my lawyers were absolutely astonished, at how they acted during that initial meeting. And as for myself, I had tried to warn my lawyers to expect this kind of behavior. I knew the devil I was dealing with. Archie's owners have never been, shall we say, enjoyed a great reputation as far as their treatment of comic book creators. Dan DeCarlo found that out. Stan Goldberg found that out. Bob Montana, the guy who created Archie, he found that out. So I was not shocked by anything that happened during that session. I'd have been shocked if they had been more positive. So when we left, Michael turns to me and said, "You were completely right." I said, "Yes, I know these guys." And so the judge laid out a schedule where there would be depositions and discovery, meaning we would get to interview the people we wanted to as far as witnesses go. They would get to interview the witnesses they wanted to get information from, and both sides would have to exchange whatever documentation we had, prior to going to court. And so the judge, let's see, this was June 1st when I was going back. The judge set up discovery so that it would take place in mid-July, that we would have to begin exchanging documents, we would have to begin discovery, and we'd only get like a couple of weeks to accomplish all this, okay? And in the meantime, Archie was filing motions trying to shut me down on this point of law or that point of law, and my lawyers were having to respond to this, on top of, here we were cooperating and submitting our documentation for discovery. And Archie, in the meantime, they were withholding, all the documentation we were requesting. As a matter of fact, they never supplied us with everything that we requested. We were still filing motions, to get the judge to um, uh, get the material released. It got so nasty at one point that Archie's lawyers actually filed a sanction against one of my lawyers um, for being untimely with turning in material, which I thought was a joke considering they hadn't even supplied us with a number of the items we requested and we were still fighting for with the judge. And it was at that point, this was like September of 2000, September 2011 we were now at, and the judge laid down the sanctions on my lawyers at that point because what Archie's lawyers did. And so Michael was always figuring out what the next move would be. At that point, he put me in contact with attorney Phil Damon, who would come to represent me through the rest of the whole ordeal. Michael was still there in the background. Michael has been terrific. I can't say enough about the job that Michael and Phil did. Phil and Jeffrey and Andre and Chris and Anthony and another Michael that was involved. Guys, it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. So Phil came in. Let's see. We were scheduled to go to court by October 31st. No, excuse me. October 21st. Excuse me. October 21st. We were scheduled to go to court. And I was literally signing up Phil to represent me, just before he was boarding the plane to go to New York. That's how chaotic it was. So he gets to New York. And, Phil goes into court. There's Judge Berman. There's Matt Wagner for Archie. And they thought that I was not going to be ready to go. So neither the judge or Archie's lawyer was actually prepared to move forward with the trial because, they thought, we were going to ask for a continuance or something. And Phil got into the court, and he told them that we were ready to go to court. What was the next step? And it so took the judge and Archie's lawyer by surprise that the judge literally pushed back the case, and he said, "Okay, we're going to file some new motions here." So Phil came back. We were working on new motions. We were making the claim here, Archie has no case, here's why. And they haven't supplied us with this, that, or the other thing. So the judge set up another court date where he was going to try and get us in for settlement. And if that didn't happen, he was going to move us forward on the case. So we went into New York. Okay, I flew back with Phil to New York for the December 12th hearing. And that was an experience in and of itself because Judge Berman pulled Archie's lawyer in first, had a talk with him, and then he pulled me and Phil and Jeffrey. Jeffrey was Phil's cousin and his partner in the law firm. And we went into Judge Berman's office, and Judge Berman is there sitting across the desk from us. And he's looking me straight in the eye, and he says, "If anybody lies in my courtroom, they are immediately going to jail." And he's looking at me really sternly. And I believe this man. There's no doubt in it, And he acknowledged that he told Archie's lawyer the same thing, that he was not going to tolerate, any nonsense in his courtroom. And basically at that point, though, it sounded like he thought Archie had the case until Jeffrey made it clear to the judge that we said Archie doesn't have any paperwork, that I never signed a work for hire agreement, and that we had witnesses who were going to corroborate this. And that's when the judge began to back down a bit, and he basically defined the case as this: if Archie has conclusive proof, conclusive work for hire documents that I signed, then Archie owns everything I did. Copyrights be damned. If I didn't sign any work for hire documents, then everything I created belongs to me. So that was it. That was the whole case right there, defined, who could prove to the judge who was in the right. And so we went back, and I proceeded to gather up all my documentation. I proceeded to round up a number of freelancers, including the editors, Justin Gabri and Scott Fulop. I got affidavits from them. I got affidavits from Scott Shaw, from Mike Kantarovich, from, Carl Bollers. I know I'm missing. There were other creators as well. I even got an affidavit from Elliot Magan, who did some freelance work for Archie, and his affidavit said he never signed any work for hire documentation. I got documentation from an affidavit from Robert Greenberger, my very first editor, who said, when I worked for him, I was provided a contract, a work for hire document. So I was establishing that here are the normal business practices at other comics companies, but Archie didn't follow those practices at all. And so when it came time to go back to court, after the judge saw what we were submitting and what Archie was submitting, basically it came down to, since he felt that I had a legitimate case, he was not going to throw out, the case at all. Okay, even though Archie's lawyer had been, Matt Wagner had been promising Archie, I will get the judge to throw this case out. And once that happened, that was the point where Archie knew that they were in some serious problems, and they got rid of Matt Wagner, and they went back to their previous attorneys. And their previous attorneys, when they got back on the case, they were starting to complain that there was this mountain of paperwork and they needed more time, and the judge wasn't prepared to give them more time. That this case had already been going on for so long as it was, that he wanted us to discuss settlement. And at that point, my attorneys and I were notifying the judge that we didn't think any settlement was possible without SEGA's involvement at that point. But Archie kept saying, no, we don't need SEGA, we don't need SEGA. They were afraid to bring in SEGA because SEGA would essentially look at Archie and say, hey, this is your mess, you made it, clean it up, give him whatever he wants. Okay, and if they were in the room and heard all the discussions, Archie would be put in a position to either agree with me that they should be paying me whatever I'm looking for, or they would disagree and they would have no choice but to walk out, and thus put themselves in jeopardy with SEGA. So as long as they could forestall that eventuality, that was another problem to be dealt with. Okay, that was definitely another problem to be dealt with. And they didn't want to deal with it then and there. They basically felt they were either going to win in court or they could resolve matters through a settlement. The big problem was, initially when Archie filed the lawsuit, they requested that it be resolved with a jury trial. And we said we were totally comfortable with that. I was totally comfortable with that. Phil was looking forward, to contesting the whole thing in front of a jury, and that's what we were preparing for. So when the day came, and this was in July of 2012. This was July 2012. We went to court, and this is when we had met with the judge, and the judge told us to see if we could still work things out before he issued his ruling on what was going to happen with the case next. So we went into the conference room. It was me, Jeffrey, Phil, and Andre, and on our side, and it was just Matt Wagner on the other. And Phil pulled off a moment. It was just right out of Perry Mason. It was just great to watch, and I had to stand there with a poker face and watch as it all unfolded. And essentially, he made Matt Wagner an offer how to resolve the case, and Matt just wouldn't bite. And I think every one of us on my side, we all had to keep poker faces at that point because we couldn't believe, what was happening right in front of us. First of all, couldn't believe Phil was making this outrageous offer to Matt Wagner. It was definitely like straight out of Perry Mason, Perry's telling the district attorney, look, I'll give you this if you give me that. And he was essentially offering Matt everything he wanted if we could have just this one thing. And Matt wouldn't bite. And once everybody left the courtroom and waiting for the judge to issue his opinion what happens next, Andre, Jeffrey, Phil, and I, we went over to a restaurant to get something to eat while we waited. And we just couldn't believe it. We could not believe what had happened in front of us. And that's when we knew what direction this whole thing was going to go. There was no doubt. If Phil had any doubts about anything I said to him before that erased any and all doubts at that point, that moment. And so we went and we waited for the judge. And the judge then said, we're going to go forward with the trial. And once Archie got that verdict, that's when they fired Matt Wagner and decided to go with their previous attorneys. So then once the previous attorneys got involved, that's when the judge said, okay, we're going to set a date, you're going to do settlement, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So we had a settlement conference, and to give you an idea of the logistics, okay, Bernie and I were in San Francisco. She was doing an industry trade show for her business, for her company she was working for, and I just brought my work along with me, to do at the hotel.
Right.
And Phil and Jeffrey were in a mediator's office with Archie's attorneys. I think John Goldwater was there. Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty sure John Goldwater was there. But the thing is, they had to have access to both John Goldwater to make decisions on Archie's side, and they had to have access to me, to make decisions on my side. And Phil made it clear that I didn't need to be there, that, we could do this through Skype, we could do this through cell phone, whatever, but I didn't need to be there, personally. So they would propose something. Phil would call me up. Phil and Mike would call me up. Mike was there too, Mike Lovitz. He was part of the negotiating team. And we went back and forth. It was an all-day affair. And it wasn't until Bernie and I were on the road heading home and we stopped to have dinner, and we got the phone call. And they said, here's the final agreement. Phil emailed me the details and asked me if I could live with it. And Mike Lovitz and the mediator proceeded to get on the line and explain to me what everything meant, And he said, look, this is just the blueprint. There's still a lot of details that need to be nailed down. And so I said, well, if you guys think this is the way to go, he goes, look, this leaves you with your claim to the copyrights. We can then move on to the SEGA lawsuit and work to resolve things on that end. So I said, fine, let's do it. So we filed with the court that we had come to an agreement with Archie. Archie had to concur with the court. I mean, both sides had to simultaneously, acknowledge this with the court. One side or the other couldn't do it themselves. So here, both sides are telling the court, done deal. And Archie said, we didn't need SEGA. So, okay, fine, we didn't need SEGA. So then we proceed to work on the finer points of the agreement. And all of a sudden, we're getting a hassle. Well, we can't do that. Well, why not? We can't do that. Why? Because then we have problems with SEGA. But you just said we didn't need SEGA, and so we kept going back and forth, and it was still another 2 months, and we still hadn't done anything. So we filed with the court saying, "Hey, these guys aren't living up to it," And there's court transcripts that are publicly available that you can read this stuff, and so the judge can't understand why, we haven't come to a full agreement. As a matter of fact, if you want to read one of the transcripts, you can go to my Twitter site, and I've got a transcript posted there where Archie's telling the judge, their lawyers are telling the judge, we can't do this without SEGA. Well, you said, you didn't need SEGA. Well, because then we're going to run into problems.
So then the judge ordered that SEGA get involved then.
So the judge ordered SEGA to get involved. And as a matter of fact, he makes it clear that their lawyer has to get in contact with his clerk, so they can schedule a mutual date for everything. Okay. So SEGA's lawyer informs the court, yes, she can, be part of the settlement talks. She will come out, so on and so forth. Okay. Now, keep in mind, Archie had signed an agreement that they would cover SEGA's legal costs, whatever they were.
Oh, really?
Well, yes, they did. Yes. Okay. And so SEGA's lawyer gets on a plane, the cost of her plane, the cost of her hotel, her meals, her billable hours. Archie's liable for that. They're on the hook. So all the lawyer is seeing is dollar signs, the tab getting run up by this action. So my lawyers that are, we get an agreement from the mediator that, okay, end of June, we have a date that's mutually agreeable by all sides, SEGA, Archie, and us. Okay. So we were planning for the meeting with all parties, on board. About 2 days before we get into the settlement discussion with the mediator, Archie's lawyer, Josh Paul, contacts us and says, we can settle this out. We don't need SEGA. We can come to an agreement. And I'm there going, nah, I don't think we can do that. And my lawyer is saying, look, if we can work on an agreement, okay, without SEGA, that's one thing. But if Archie's just playing a game here, we just simply go back to court, say, look, they said we didn't need SEGA, that they would negotiate in good faith, and they did. So now we definitely need SEGA, and we would hold firm on that. So basically, when Phil told me, we're not going to lose anything by agreeing to this, I said, okay, fine, let's go forth. So we had the settlement talks, and they went on for the longest time, and it didn't seem like we were going to get anywhere. And I think Phil was about to leave the room when Josh Paul started to break down, and Phil was able to chip away at getting things agreed to, because there was no way we were walking out of that room without a definitive settlement one way or the other. It was not going to be as nebulous as the one in November. We were going to get point by point nailed down. Okay. And to give you an indication as such, one of the issues involved the issue of credit. Okay. Here was Archie putting the names of the creators on their books. Okay. But they weren't doing that with my name on any of the books. And I was most insistent. Anything comes out that I created, I was going to get a credit on the cover, just like the other creators were. And here are these books, and they're now starting to show the credit of all the previous creators, with mine listed first. I was happy. That was, but as it would develop, we had to fight every step of the way for Archie to live up to the terms. And they still haven't lived up to the full terms that they agreed to. I got what mattered most to me. Okay. But let's keep in mind here too, okay, that Archie didn't need to reboot the series the way they did. They didn't need to eliminate my characters the way they did. Okay. And while I can't go into the details of why, okay, I can say that that was something. I personally, I'm surprised that they did what they did for a number of reasons. Okay, one is based on the arguments that they were making during the settlement talks and in court. Okay, that it would have been in both their interests and SEGA's, had they continued to use my characters and storylines as the basis for the new material, because it would have served them, their interest in the long term, had there been any future legal battles. They didn't do that. It would also have protected them from SEGA had they done such an issue, because right now, as it stands, they haven't. SEGA has a legitimate claim to go after Archie for not protecting their assets. You have this huge 25 plus year library of stories that SEGA should have owned outright, but because Archie didn't have any work for hire paperwork signed, they have no claim to at all.
So obviously that wasn't even covered then, obviously, in Archie's initial license agreement with SEGA then too. It must not have been. Or that just didn't extend to you because you were...
I can't address that question specifically because I have not had access to any documentation between Archie and SEGA. Okay. What information I do know regarding those documents only came out in arguments, that were, or discussions held in court, or when I was in the room during depositions. And there would be times where something would be brought up and then I would have to leave the room because Archie would say this is confidential, and my attorneys would later tell me they didn't think it should have been confidential, especially since it's like tying the witness, with their hands behind their back, not able to defend themselves if they don't hear exactly what the opponent is saying. So, but I got enough of the gist, to know what was going on.
Well, going back to what you said about you got what you wanted, at least,
Yes.
in a nutshell, what was that, and what thoughts and reflections are you left with over the comic itself and over your tenure in legal battles? I know you touched a little bit on the reboot. If there's any more you wanted to say about that too at all.
Okay. Let me put it to you this way. Regarding the reboot, okay, they tried to handle it in a way that, cut off any claims I had to any future work on any future issues. Okay. However, the way Ian Flynn tried to have his cake and eat it too with the storyline, here, the characters basically have no knowledge of what happened before, except in a couple instances. I think like Robotnik knows what was going on, and maybe the characters, a couple characters had some limited memory, something like that. So in essence, that opened the door to future claims on my part against them. And as a matter of fact, we never resolved those issues regarding the material published after the reboot. We were supposed to, but we never did. And that's part of why I can say that, Archie has never fully lived up to the terms of the settlement, because there are issues they never addressed, never wanted to address. And, now that they've totally washed their hands of the book, I think that they just, hope everything just goes away and nothing ever happens.
Right, because they canceled it in 2017.
And basically, first of all, I'm proud of, what I did on the book. Okay. Ian had the chance when he got on that book, for example, to take that book in a totally new and different direction. Okay. And he didn't, and Ian basically got into the toy box, and he was happy to work in that toy box. And, he said that he wanted to make it more game centric. Well, fine. Okay. But again, that's not staking out an original vision. He basically took what he had. He had all this material to play with. He didn't have to create everything from scratch the way we did, is what I'm saying here. So his task was totally different from the one that faced everybody up until that point. Is what do we do? What is a SEGA story? What is a Sonic story? We had nobody to guide us. Ian was the first of the fans that started working on the book, as far as writing the stories go. I got to be careful here, because Dawn Best, who I brought in, was actually the very first fan who was elevated to the ranks of the professionals when I had her pencil the Knuckles story in the backup of Sonic 101 and 102. And I have to tell you, it's not just stories I'm proud of in my working on the Sonic book. It's being able to give opportunities to people like Dawn and Amber Green Lane and others. I was really proud that, like when I did Sonic Super Special 11, that I could approach various creators, James Fry, Pat Spaziante, Colleen Duran, Jim Valentino, and ask them if they would pencil the stories I wrote. I would ink them. I was very proud of what we were doing behind the scenes. When we did the Sonic Image crossover, and I was, even able to include my own characters and even put in the copyright notice and the indicia for my characters. It was it was all sorts of things. It wasn't just the stories. It was the accomplishments along the way. For example, Sonic Live. I did the very first airbrush painted cover. No, that was Raven World. Excuse me. No, but Sonic Live was airbrushed, right? But it was also with photos as well. So I did the first photo cover, first airbrush cover. I was doing. It was the experimentation I was able to do throughout my entire run. That I look back on those years. I'm proud of what we did. And it wasn't just me. I never made it sound like it was just my show. Because I had a number of great collaborators. The artists, the colorists, the letterers. They were terrific. We felt like we were a team pushing to get the whole thing done, because it really was. You were in the trenches together. You were trying to get the book out. During the entire run I was there, it always seemed like it could just end at any given moment, because the publisher certainly didn't give a damn about the book. The only thing they cared about is how much of profit they were making. For example, when we got the word that Knuckles was being canceled, it wasn't because it was losing money. It was because it wasn't making as much profit as they were used to. And part of the problem was, by the time the later issues were coming out, there was a thing called Star Wars: The Phantom Menace that was coming out, and Dark Horse was starting to publish more and more Star Wars comics. So newsstands were putting more Star Wars titles because they understood Star Wars titles. The Sonic Super Special and the Knuckles series, newsstand vendors kind of considered them small potatoes in comparison to Star Wars, so they got hit the worst. And because Archie was so dependent on newsstand sales, when we lost rack space because of the Star Wars titles, when Walmart took out comic book sales, we lost sales to the tune of like 10,000 copies. Whether it was Knuckles, whether it was Sonic Super Special, even the Sonic book took a hit as a result of what Walmart did at that time. So we were fighting for survival on a number of fronts during that time, and it was always something to overcome. So yeah, I'm proud of that. And it's also things like when Dan DiCarlo was in his fight against Archie, and I took a very public stand in support of Dan. And when the publishers of Archie discovered, I was supporting Dan, just on my website, they actually had me suspended for a month, from getting work from Archie Comics, because they thought that was being insubordinate. I wasn't saying anything bad about the publishers. I was just saying I think Dan deserves, to get royalties and better treatment, that kind of thing. So
That's one thing I actually wonder with the whole lawsuit and everything like that. How did that affect your relation to not only Archie but to the comic book industry and to the other publishers in general? Was there any blowback from that?
Well, the thing is, I wasn't interested in working by that time. By the time the whole lawsuit thing took off, I was more or less moving professionally in different directions. I've been working on a film project, for example, which I'm on the verge of finally completing. That started roughly about the time of the lawsuit. So, and I've been doing freelance projects. So I was, Bernie has been really encouraging me, to take on projects where I have full control, as opposed to working for somebody like a Marvel or DC, where I sign over the rights to my work. I'm just not interested in that. It's you know, I did some work for Marvel, did some work for DC, other companies, been there, done that. I'm someone who's always looking for something new and fresh to shoot for.